Colombo Albert, and I first went to Vietnam in the spring of 1970 as part of a Yippie anti-war delegation. My traveling companion was Nancy Kershan. Nancy and I were essentially original founding members of the Yippies, who I think this demographic knows who the Yippies were, but I'm happy to explain if you need to. The reason that we were invited to Vietnam, and Frank claims he doesn't remember this, but I remember it very clearly, is that during the trial of the Chicago 8, the Chicago 8 had received a message from a delegation of what was then North Vietnamese saying, you got to come up and meet with us. All the conspiracy defendants wanted to go, but the lawyers, Bill Kunstler and Lenny Weinglass, said, absolutely not. We don't want you to violate any terms of your probation or whatever it was they were on, because if they had, they would have been sent to jail. So I and Frank went instead to meet this delegation of Vietnamese in Montreal. And I was the Yippie representative, and Frank represented, I would say, the straighter side of the conspiracy style, the less... Go ahead.
No, you characterize it. Any way you want.
The straighter. And what that resulted in was a number of meetings that I had with various representatives from North Vietnam, and eventually Nancy and G.D. Plumundon of the White Panther Party and I went in 1970. And the purpose of it really, as I see it now from 40 years later, was to come back to the United States and explain the humanitarian consequences of the war.
My name's Frank Joyce. I'm a lifetime Detroiter. But from that base, I started out in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and that led me into opposition to the war. One thing led to another, and on a different delegation from the one that Judy was on, I became one of the people who, anti-war activists who went to Vietnam, then known here as North Vietnam. Also in my case, in the spring of 1970. This is a separate story, but just as a reference point, I was in Vietnam, not in Hanoi, but somewhere south of there, on the day that the students were killed at Kent State, and which was a very impactful experience for the Vietnamese, and of course for myself and the three colleagues who I was traveling with at that time. The trip that we all just came back from is an outgrowth of a trip that I was on with Marianne in 2006, going back to Vietnam. Met a woman there who afterwards came up with the idea of doing a book about anti-war activists who had been to Vietnam during the war. And that was sort of the nucleus of organizing this trip and this delegation that was there for the 40th anniversary of the signing of the Paris Peace Accords. And I'll have some more to say about that, as will Judy here in a minute. So I think that's plenty by way of introduction. Judy has some points she wants to make. I have a few, and then really we want this to be a conversation.
And also, I guess the first thing I want to say is that I'm really delighted to see the Vietnam vets here. We've always felt, in the anti-war movement, an affinity with Vietnam vets. And let me just leave it at that, and we can get in more about that relationship later if you decide you want to do that. So as Frank said, we were there to celebrate, we were invited to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Paris Peace Accords. And the celebration itself took place in this large auditorium. We actually were escorted there by a police escort in our bus. The reason was not because we were necessarily celebrities, but because they had to get us there in time, and the traffic there is ridiculous. Well, everybody's on little motorbikes, and so the police were just basically waving the motorbikes aside in order to get us through. What I remember most about the celebration mention were a couple of things. One was that behind, that there was a presentation, and there was films were being shown behind that showed Ho Chi Minh, starting with Ho Chi Minh, and went through the entire trajectory of the war, the bombings, the fighting back, the Paris Peace Accords, and also then the 2 years between the signing of the Accords and the actual liberation of the South. And while that was going on, there were interpretive dances and live people, rather the film behind, they were doing these marvelous interpretive dances and singing. And what I remember most about that, at a certain point, this line of young women and men came out, and they were not Vietnamese. Everyone else so far had been Vietnamese. They were not Vietnamese. In fact, they were, what I learned later, students at the University of Hanoi from various countries. They were all white people. They were all white kids, and they were dressed like hippies. And one of them even had a guitar and was pretending to be Bob Dylan. And what it was like, oh yeah, okay, there's an acknowledgement that we too were part of that. So that was great. And actually, before the event started, I remember going up to, there was this line of people who were older than you guys sitting down, and they were clearly generals and people who had fought in the war because they were wearing their uniforms, women and men, with their medals. And I went up and down the line, and I said, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I shook their hands, and they beamed. They absolutely beamed. And the reason essentially for that was that they, in Vietnam, and we got this over and over and over again, were very, very grateful for what the anti-war movement did to help them free their country. And that was something I think that we learned as we were there. I remember being told that back in 1970, but it didn't resonate. But when I went this time, it really did resonate, that there was a lot of gratitude there to the anti-war movement. And I remember also going up to Madame Bin, and I just that name ring a bell. She was a negotiator at the Paris Peace Accord. She was also a head of the Vietnam Women's Union. She was a hero to those of us in the anti-war movement back in the day. And I gave her, and we made a T-shirt that had her image on it, and it said Nguyen Thi Binh on the bottom, and it said "Live like her" on the top. But we didn't silkscreen the T-shirt very well, so it came out "Live like her." Live like her instead of live like her. It came out live like her. All the words were bunched together. So it was known in the women's movement as the Live like her T-shirt. And I gave Madame Bin a copy of a picture of me, because I was in the demonstrations in Miami Beach at the Republican Convention in 1972. And there's a woman beside me who was wearing a Live like her T-shirt. And I said to her, and I gave it to her, and I said, I just want you to have this, so just you to see this is your picture, and this is and I said, and thank you also for what you did. And she said, and we will continue to do it. And then she squeezed my hand, and I was like, oh my, because she was like a total hero of mine. So this was really wonderful, and it was, and then everywhere we went, and you'll see, I think you see if you look on the website, you'll see the picture. There were signs that said, "Warmly welcome the anti-war activists from the United States of America, or from America, or from the United States." It just depended, I think, on how much room they had on the sign, and because some of them were hand printed, some of them were not, and it just really felt good. That what I keep saying is that my trip in 1970 was life-changing, because when I went back, what I did was go, as I said, and talk about the humanitarian consequences of the war, and it changed the direction and the trajectory of my life. But this trip was life-affirming, and to me, the fact that you guys are sitting here now just really continues to affirm that. It really does. It's really very moving to me as a testament to something, to the kind of peace I think that we all believe in. So I just want to talk about two more things very briefly. One is the devastation. They both have to do with the devastation that the war wrought and what we saw today. One of the things that we saw was the effects of unexploded ordnance. Now, you guys may recognize this, and I'll pass it around, but this is a pellet bomb. It's unexploded. I mean, it's not going to explode. I can guarantee that. We saw a number of these on display in the museums in Vietnam, all the way through Vietnam. They, and this was given to me in 1970. It was almost given to me. Oh, here, you might as well have this, because there were so many of them around that they were literally just giving them away. And if you look, you'll see there's tiny pellets in each one of those, right? So each tiny little pellets in each one. So what would happen is uncountable numbers of these would be put in what they called mother bombs. The mother bombs would be dropped from the B-52s. These then would explode and set. And if you were any kind of living creature within within range, it could kill you and certainly maim you. And so when we went especially to Quang Tri Province, which was one of the, because that's where the DMZ was. It was one of the most heavily bombed areas, and there's still such a danger. Still, essentially, they showed us that they have posters up for the kids that show these. And big X signs, and don't pick them up, because the kid's coming along in the field. He sees, oh, look at this, is cute. I'll pick it up, and boom, because they are unexploded, unlike this one, which is clearly exploded. And that's one of the things that the Vietnamese really have to deal with. And really, it seemed like all they had to discover the unexploded ordnance that still exists. It was metal detectors, just like the kind that we have, and shovels and picks. And that's literally what they have to be able to stop it. So it's really one unexploded ordnance. If there are any of the negative, among the many negative legacies of the war, unexploded ordnance is one. And then the other is the poisoning of the earth and the water that took place as a result of the dropping of Agent Orange and dioxin, and especially in Da Nang. And I wrote something at the time, and I just thought I would read it to you, because it explains way better than I can what it was like to meet some of the people who'd been, and the children especially, who'd been affected by Agent Orange. So the most emotional experience so far is the visit to Friendship Village, where we walked into a room filled with child victims of Agent Orange. This trip has been fast-paced, but here time slowed. I was in tears. All I thought was, we are responsible. I am responsible. I hate the word victim, but in this case it was apt. 5,000 victims live in the Da Nang area, 1,400 Mongoloid children, faces and backs of heads flat, eyes slanted in that recognizable way, girls and boys, some with feet deformed and 4 toes, and the little girl, perfectly formed, but only at best 2 feet tall. Ageless, an expression on her expression under her straight brown hair and pixie face of such unbearable sadness, it broke my heart. The other children laughed and clapped. She never joined in or smiled, as if she understood she'd been cheated of a normal life by toxic chemicals leached into and poisoning the soil 3 generations before she had been born. I believe, although I have no evidence of this, that she understood whatever chance at normality her soul might have possessed, had it been born into another body, had been cruelly taken from her by military decisions made in the United States and implemented at the Da Nang Air Base 40 years ago. I was unable to join in the raucous Gagnab-style dance that the other children and my compatriots on the trip enjoyed. She had disappeared, as if the noise and celebration with the fun-loving intensity disabled children can muster disturbed her soul. I am responsible for the tragedy of this life, I told myself, yet I feel powerless to help. And these kids, so that was really, those were the 2 experiences. And I think I'll just pass it on to Frank.
One of the most significant things about this trip is captured by Judy's description of this ceremony that took place in Hanoi, which was the official national observance of this important anniversary of the peace treaty that was signed on January 27th, 1973, for which Henry Kissinger, of all people, got the Nobel Peace Prize. Along with his Vietnamese co-negotiator. The ceremony itself was televised live on national TV. We were in the country for 10 days. Virtually, we were on national television in Vietnam virtually every one of those days, and there were extensive print media stories about us and about other people who had come from France and from other countries to observe this 40th anniversary of what formalized the military withdrawal and active combat role of the United States in Vietnam. As we know, the war continued for 2 more years. This was a big deal in Vietnam. Towards the end of the trip, some of us were invited and featured as honored guests at a 2.5-hour, 3-city, very sophisticated, complicated television program commemorating the end of the war and the Paris Peace Accords and so on, which was attended by hundreds of people and again televised all over the country. The number of stories in the mainstream media noting the anniversary of the signing of the Paris Peace Accords was 0. Not one in the United States. Not one story. Google it. Not one story. It's a cliche to say that we're the United States of amnesia, but we really work very hard, which I believe derives from a nation founded, whose economy and government was founded on chattel slavery and on genocide against indigenous people. Forgetting becomes not just a habit, although it does become a habit, but it becomes a way of life. It becomes a way of never processing anything. We haven't processed slavery. We haven't processed the Civil War. So why would we process the Vietnam War? And why would we learn anything from Vietnam that would have, and as peace activists, I'm sure we all share this frustration and have now for many years, but why would we learn to not do a version of the same thing all over again in Iraq or Afghanistan or Pakistan or Iran? We're all of a certain age, with a couple of exceptions in this room. There's not a day in my life that the United States has not been at war with somebody. We live in a culture that thinks that it's normal to always be at war. Now, we're peace activists, so we have some awareness of that, and we think about it, and we try to do things about it. And the message, the number one message that I came back from this trip was, well, we did build a successful anti-war movement. And having done it once, it's inspiring to see the impact of the Vietnamese acknowledgement of the role that we played. And because we need that. This is, I feel, a kinship with all of you. The reason to do a meeting like this is to share with you our inspiration and invigoration at being, at people who are grateful for what we did and who acknowledge that it was a part of their achieving their goal. I want to say a word about the goal. After the ceremony, we came out and Mary Ann got in a conversation with obviously an older than people in this room gentleman in his military whites with all kinds of medals, dripping with medals, who happened to be a pretty good speaker of English. And so we got in quite a long conversation with him, and people on our bus were mad at us and wanted us to come back, get back on the bus. But what came from that conversation that will always stay with me from that trip is he said he also had been involved with a lot of observances of the 40th anniversary and had done interviews with people, and he said he had just been interviewed the day before by somebody who I think was from Australian television or something. And the interviewer said to him, "Can you please explain to our viewers how it was that Vietnam defeated the United States?" And he said, "That's the wrong question. Vietnam did not defeat the United States. How could our little country defeat a nation with 6,000 nuclear weapons and the biggest military machine that has ever existed in the history of the world? We did not defeat the United States. We defended our country." That's a pretty deep comment, I thought. Fast forward more towards the end of the trip, and we got a very interesting version of the same thing when we were touring the famous, and now the name is escaping me, somebody here will remember, but the famous tunnels, the Cu Chi tunnels. And they are a remarkable military, ecological, political achievement by any standards, and they did, in fact, give the Vietnamese a way to counteract the technological military superiority of B-52 bombers and cluster bombs and napalm and Agent Orange and all the firepower that the United States brought to bear. The Pentagon has a big task force working on how to reinterpret, and my phrase is refight the Vietnam War for the general public of the United States over the next 2 years between now and the April 30th, 1975 anniversary of the end of the war. Vietnam needs to still be on the agenda, is still on the agenda, and is going to be put on the agenda of the public conversation whether we do anything about it or not. So I think it's important for us to understand the context of a new national conversation about this war that's already underway. And it's important in part because I think it's an opportunity to combat the United States of amnesia. And it's an opportunity to talk about the continuing price that the Vietnamese are paying for our horrendous foreign policy and for our tendency to again and again and again think that we have not just the opportunity but some cockamamie moral obligation to go into other nations and tell them how they ought to behave, and find out that they don't want to be told how to behave and that they have ways to resist being told how to behave, just as we did when we became independent from England in the first place. So that's the sort of distillation of what I think is a takeaway message. I want to sort of go off on a little bit of tangent here very briefly, because a few of us, after this incredible, very intense experience in Vietnam, had the brilliant idea of going from Vietnam to Cambodia. I'd never been to Cambodia before. I think I knew that the United States, of course, had bombed Cambodia in secret for many years and wreaked all manner of havoc on the Cambodian people, and that it was a secret campaign for a very long time, wasn't really acknowledged after the fact. But I certainly am still powerfully affected by being in the most traumatized nation, the most traumatized place I've ever been. And I'm from Detroit. In the first place, of course, the United States, the most conservative estimate is directly killed 200,000 Cambodians with this secret bombing campaign. The purpose of the bombing campaign, of course, was not because we were at war with Cambodia. We weren't at the time. It was because we took it upon ourselves to have the right to try to interdict Vietnamese traffic moving military equipment through Cambodia into Vietnam. And in case you didn't happen to notice it, the fact that the United States bombed Cambodia is now a linchpin of the legal position of the Obama administration that we have the right to send Predator drones to kill anybody we want any place in the world. Yeah, there was a New York Times story about this just recently and a little bit of other coverage. And if you drill way, way down into the stories, you get to Cambodia. But that's not the only, in that regard, Cambodia is not so unlike Laos or Vietnam. What makes Cambodia different that I had never really wrapped my head around before is that the fact of the American bombing campaign and the fact of the United States overthrowing the Sihanouk government destabilized Cambodia and created the conditions for Pol Pot to take power in Cambodia, who killed 2 million people, 25% of the population of Cambodia. To be in Cambodia is to meet, from taxi drivers to guides to government officials, if you're above a certain age, all of Cambodia has PTSD. That nation is still, I mean, if we heard it once, we heard it I don't know how many times. People say some version of, we still can't figure out what happened. We still don't understand. One thing led to another, and on a different delegation from the one that Judy was on, I became one of the people who, anti-war activists who went to Vietnam, then known here as North Vietnam, also in my case in the spring of 1970. This is a separate story, but just as a reference point, I was in Vietnam, not in Hanoi, but somewhere south of there, on the day that the students were killed at Kent State. And
My name is Judy Gumbo Albert, and I first went to Vietnam in the spring of 1970 as part of a Yippie anti-war delegation. My traveling companion was Nancy Kershan. Nancy and I were essentially original founding members of the Yippies, who representatives from North Vietnam, and eventually Nancy and G.D. Plamunden of the White Panther Party and I went in 1970. And the purpose of it really, as I see it now from 40 years later, was to come back to the United States and explain the humanitarian consequences of the war.
My name's Frank Joyce. I'm a lifetime Detroiter, but from that base, I started out in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and that led me into opposition to the war.
I think this demographic knows who the Yippies were, but I'm happy to explain if you need to. And the reason that we were invited to Vietnam, and Frank claims he doesn't remember this, but I remember it very clearly, is that during the trial of the Chicago 8, the Chicago 8 had received a message from a delegation of what was then North Vietnamese saying, you got to come up and meet with us. All the conspiracy defendants wanted to go, but the lawyers, Bill Kunstler and Lenny Weinglass, said, absolutely not. We don't want you to violate any terms of your probation or whatever it was they were on, because if they had, they would have been sent to jail. So I and Frank went instead to meet this delegation of Vietnamese in Montreal. And I was the Yippie representative, and Frank represented, I would say, the straighter side of the conspiracy style, the less, go ahead.
No, you carry it. Anyway, you want
the straighter. And what that resulted in was a number of meetings that I had with various